Hi, let's talk about energy. So we're going to break down the next kind of unit based on some of the processes of the organelles we've learned about. So we'll focus in on mitochondria and chloroplasts, but first, our delicious introduction to energy and question number one on the question guide of energy and life. The answer obviously is true. Let's go. Okay, so you guys know this. You need the energy for to live. Um, where do you get it? Where do you get it? From your cereal and from your Funyuns. But how do you make the Funyuns in this cereal? Son, we need producers, right? So the producers, number two, the sun is the ultimate source of all that energy. Of course, almost all the energy on Earth. Because of producers, right? We know about doing photosynthesis, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is some of those different forms of energy we're going to be working on. Like I mentioned a second ago, it's photosynthesis, right? That's the process, and we'll review in a second, like autotrophs, heterotrophs. It's stuff you should probably know. Maybe I'll mention now. I'll mention now. So we talk about autotrophs and heterotrophs. Auto means self, hetero means other. Troph has to do with food. So autotrophs make their own food, heterotrophs get the food from other sources. You and I, we're heterotrophs. Plants, autotrophs, obviously. Forms of energy, so number three, you guys could brainstorm these. You know that energy comes in a lot of forms. You took physical science. We got light, heat, electricity. But the energy we're concerned about, that we're thinking about here is chemical energy. So the energy stored in the chemical compounds. And the way we're going to think about it is the energy stored in the bonds within a chemical compound. So we're going to be thinking about what's going on with the bonds there. So that's our introduction. That's number three. So that'll be introduction to the most important energy chemical in everything. This is all living things use this. It's one of these kind of fundamental characteristics of life is we all have a very similar form of energy. So next, I'll tell you about it. So here it is, this strange little molecule that we use in all our cells. And when I say we, I don't mean people only. I mean people on palm trees and mushrooms and yeast and bacteria. Okay, I mean, oh, and also birds, mostly birds. We all use this stuff called ATP. It's called adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so it is the basic source of energy in a cell. We don't get it from eating food. We get it from converting the food that we eat. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, how we make the ATP. Not in great detail, but I'll introduce you to it. And that's what mitochondria do. They help us convert the food that we eat into a whole bunch of ATPs. All right, so again, number four, adenosine triphosphate. We'll talk about that in a second, but ATP is what we call this boy. Let's talk about the parts of an ATP. There are really three parts, and I'll have you label this on number five. We got an adenine, we've got a ribose. So together, the adenine and the ribose, we call it adenosine. Okay, that's what we would combine them together. So we've got our adenine and our ribose. Ribose is the same sugar that we find in RNA. That's why it's called ribonucleic acid. It's the same sugar. And adenine is the A that we know is in DNA, A, T, C, and G. So these are molecules that are used in a lot of different contexts. The third component part, the three P's there, that's our triphosphate, right? So we have three different phosphate groups attached to each other and then to the ribose on one end. All right, so we have our adenosine, which is the left two things, adenine and ribose, and then our triphosphate. On the right are three phosphate groups. And there's ATP. Okay, so we want to contrast ATP with this little thing called ADP. D for di, so this would be two phosphates. So the difference between ADP and ATP, as you can see here, is that adenosine diphosphate has but two phosphates. All right, and so adenosine triphosphate has three. So that'll answer number 6 on our notes for you. And then number 7 is also here about how do we store energy? Well, we add that third phosphate. And you'll see on the bottom here, we'll revisit this idea later, the analogy here of the partially charged battery. So ADP is like a partially charged battery. You can add more energy to it. You can charge it up by adding that third phosphate and turning it into an ATP. All right, so we'll mention that in a second, number 9. But for now, just know energy is stored in ADP by adding that third phosphate, okay? Okay, so number 8, when is energy released from ATP? Well, as you can see here, if we remove that third phosphate, it releases energy. So if we break that bond between the second and third phosphates right there, there it was, you release a whole bunch of energy, right? So in our bodies, we're constantly storing energy and then releasing it. All right, so we power that whole mechanism by our ATP, or by our mitochondria to make ATP. That's why we call mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell, because it's just generating all these ATPs, and then we use the energy from them, and then we regenerate more. So it's constantly cycling with ADP. So ATP and ADP cycle constantly. And we add those third phosphates, we remove them, so we have energy. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but to do all the stuff that we do, to think and talk and watch birds and whatever. So there you go. And that was a nice little graphic where we had our fun little explosion when we released energy by removing that third phosphate. Okay, so number 9 says describe the difference between ADP and ATP with the battery analogy. It's the perfect analogy. So this slide actually here doesn't address it, but I need to say it with my face because I've kind of mentioned it, but let's be real clear about number 9. ADP is a partially charged battery. ATP is a fully charged battery. All right, and so they just cycle back and forth. Excuse me, because mitochondria go ahead and power up those ATP. So it's a battery. So we charge that battery up. That's our ATP. We use energy from it to make our ADP. We charge that back up, right? So that's number 9. That's what I'm talking about. And what I want to leave you with is this: some of those things that we use the energy from ATP, that we harvest from ATP, for some of the kind of general cellular activities we do. So we're going to talk about later transport, so how stuff gets in and out of cells. That's a topic that we'll get to in a couple weeks. We also have protein synthesis. Making proteins takes some energy. Well, hey, we use it from ATP. Moving your muscles obviously requires energy. So this is all harvested from ATP. So super useful. And again, like I mentioned before, it's used in all forms of life. They all use ATP at some point because it's just one of those characteristics of life. Use energy, and it's ATP is the chemical form that we use all that energy. So there's our introduction to energy also and life.